There is quite possibly, quite probably, quite certainly no human on this planet who doesn't face challenges or who hasn't at some point in their lives faced challenges. So Helen Keller provides us with an insight into this. So Helen Keller could not see, could not hear, arguably one of the most dependent people, and yet also one of the most self-determined people, and one of history's highest achieving people. And she tells us, as she puts it, I cannot do everything, but I can do something. I must not fail to do the something I can do.
Hello, I'm Dr. Linda Ulrich, and welcome to the Conspiracy of Goodness podcast, where you'll hear from people around the world who are solving some of the world's most vexing problems, and they still think the future is bright. We can learn from their insights and be lifted up by the progress they're making. And here's the thing, we're just not going to hear enough about this progress unless we search for it. Today, we're going to meet an amazing thought leader named Daniel Kish. Now, his name may be familiar to you because he has been seen by over 2.5 billion people around the planet. Daniel is called the original Batman, and that's because he sees the world with sound. He lost both his eyes as an infant and taught himself to see the world with echolocation like bats and dolphins. And Daniel is a friend of mine. He was one of the earliest people to have a nice long chat with me when I was just starting out the Goodness Exchange 10 years ago. So this podcast episode is really special because recently Daniel came to visit me here in Vermont, and we decided to sit down right here in my office and record a chat about all kinds of things. Daniel has some amazing ideas about how we all can cope with our own moments where we feel a lack of ability in our surroundings. You know, a lot of people use the word disability for people that are blind like Daniel, but he's going to turn that notion around for you. In this episode, he gives us some fascinating ideas about adaptation and wonderful perspectives to bring into our own lives. And he just tells us how it is to be a really capable blind person in our modern world. Turns out Daniel travels the world at all times. Sometimes I'll text him in the evening and he'll be in Nepal or London or South Africa or Saudi Arabia. So this is a man who deserves our attention. We need to look at what Daniel's doing and open our own minds to all the possibility around us. And so I can't say enough about Daniel's work, and I'm so delighted that he's here with us. And God, please just excuse the awkwardness of us filming right here in my little office, but otherwise enjoy this lovely conversation. We're going to talk a lot today about adaptation because that is essentially one of Daniel's main messages, is that we all have ways to adapt to the challenges in our lives, and certainly we have a lot of challenges. But this adaptation that you've discovered has so much potential to point to what's possible with these beautiful things that we have between our ears, right?
Yeah, well, the brain has arguably nearly limitless capacity to be neuroplastic.
Yeah.
And one of the arenas that has really explored this very well would be stroke and traumatic brain injury recovery. So that's where a lot of the research exists on neuroplasticity and how it can be activated and facilitated.
So none of us should think we're stuck. We do have challenges. That's part of life for everybody, not just blind folks or hearing impaired or all the things that can trip us up in life.
Well, blind folks are just an exemplar of the human condition. So blind people face significant challenges associated with blindness that if you adapt to blindness, you are able to navigate those challenges. But what you're really doing is you're navigating the kinds of challenges that beset many, many humans, not specifically blindness, but what lies endemic to many, if not most challenges, is some element of the unknown, right? So we don't know something, we're not certain about something, so we have a difficult decision to make that involves making some sort of calculation around the unknown element, whatever that happens to be. The thing that I'm most known for, and the thing that seems to be, you mentioned the mothership, kind of the flagship of our approach, is the use of echolocation as a kind of cousin to vision, to allow, well, anyone really, but blind people in particular, to create images in their mind from what is actually around them by bouncing sound off of surfaces that are around us, and then using the returning patterns of those reflections to construct images. And we know from modern examinations and testing that it is the visual cortex, which should really be better named the imaging cortex, that is centrally involved, or at least very much involved, in the process of constructing these images.
So you make a kind of I just have to tell you, we live on a farm in Vermont, and we have now spent 2 days hiking in the deep woods up and down hill and dale with Daniel. And he he makes a clicking sound at the world around him. And is it fair to say that when you started doing this as a baby, the part of your brain that would have been devoted to sight got tapped into to create this sort of mental images of the sound coming back to you? So it's like a reflection, right?
It is a reflection. I mean, when people see things around them, they are seeing reflected light. You don't actually see things. What you see are patterns of reflected light. And your brain constructs images from those patterns of reflected light that represent those things. Okay, so sound to a degree can do a similar thing. If you bounce sound off of things, just like you bounce light off of things, it returns to the listener carrying impressions from the surfaces from which the sound bounced. It is a way of seeing. It is perhaps the way of seeing that is most analogous to the way sighted people see. A blind person who has adapted to blindness, who is able to function, I'll say productively, as a blind person, is going to use a multisensorium. So they're going to use multiple sensory input to quote unquote see, to be able to understand their environment, to be able to develop a relationship between themselves and the world, a working relationship, an operational, functional, dynamic relationship with their world. What echolocation allows is it fills in a lot of gaps that are left when someone who is not sighted decides to function in a world where nearly all organisms evolve the capacity to use light as a medium to function. So if you can't use light as a medium, what do? You can do lots of things, but you're filling a gap. You're filling a gap in terms of how you understand what's around you. Vision is terrific at telling creatures what is around them, where things are, how to get to those things, what to do with those things. Basically, how to move about your environment securely, efficaciously, and efficiently. And if you don't have vision to do that, if you can't access light to do that, then you develop a whole constellation of ways to do that. Echolocation happens to be one of those things that is a pretty critical bridge to help close that gap.
You know, the other night we were watching a show about the James Webb Telescope, and they were going on about that's exactly what we're doing when we're trying to decide how far away something is. We're measuring the reflected light back from it.
Yes.
And all of a sudden, I've known you for 5 years, and all of a sudden I understood what you meant by that. In this room, you can tell how far that wall is away from us, even though you can't see it, because I'm judging it by my sight, and you're looking at it through sound.
Walls and other surfaces, yes, walls and
trees.
different
the other
kinds
day
of
when
objects.
we were hiking.
Well, yeah. Yeah.
It was so strange.
Yeah. So when we work with people, we teach the whole multisensorium. We teach everything, which has to do with touch. It has to do with descriptive language. It has to do with how you access your support system, how you build and manage your support system. And of course, it has to do with your hearing, what you hear, and how you use what you hear and how you relate to what you hear.
Can you give us a little example? You might see there's a bag on the day bed behind us. You got some way to?
So, well, that launches into what I call okay. Well, two things.
Okay.
One, when I look at self-determination, I look at the embodiment of three key qualities that we look for when we self-determine our way through life and livelihood.
All of us,
through
not
the
just
world.
blind people.
I think it's everyone.
Yeah.
I think it's everyone. Now, different people will. So let me say the qualities first.
Mhm.
So the qualities are security. How physically and or mentally secure are we? How secure do we feel? How secure do we know ourselves to be? Which is essentially safety and confidence. So confidence is a kind of a part of security, but it's also how secure do people feel around you and about you? That is a key aspect of security. These days, certainly blind children, but sighted children as well, are victims of a fear-based culture, a fear-based society, fear-based parenting, where we now have an epidemic of helicopter parenting and micromanagement parenting, which doesn't really instill a kind of security in our children, because it's essentially telling our children that we aren't secure about them. The security that we feel is roughly as important as the security that other people feel about us. And if you're blind, then you kind of come up against other people's security about you, because people feel that you're unsafe. They may feel awkward around you. They may feel, how can this person manage? They can't see. And so there's this general lack of confidence about a blind person's security. So that's security. Then there's efficacy. So how effective and efficient are you at doing things, at carrying out tasks, at conducting your activities? What are your levels of effectiveness? And the third is equality, which is kind of a big one. It really has to do with your sense of equality with others and other people's sense of your equality with them. Okay, so it goes back and forth. There's always this kind of social interplay among these things. And with equality also comes inclusivity. So people don't tend to include things that they don't feel are equal. So it factors into inclusion and inclusivity, and it factors into sense of belonging. It's hard to feel a sense of belonging when you do not feel a sense of equality or equitability. Mm-hmm. So that's those are the qualities that I would say underpin self-determination. But there are also strategies. There are actions that we take, ways that we do self-determination. And I call it the ACTS framework.
Oh, I love this. It's so true.
So, yeah.
I know, you were explaining to me the other day. I said, oh my gosh, that's all of us.
So the ACTS framework, ACTS, essentially stands for adaptations, capacity, technology, and social engagement and support, or socialization and support.
When you face a challenge, then you can put the ACTS framework into place. Am I right about that?
I think anyone, so if you think about the ACTS framework, you can almost do a checklist, right? I'm facing a challenge. So what adaptations do I need? What capacities do I need to bring to bear on this challenge? If I don't have them, either I need to build them or I access support, right, from someone who has them. and or technology. So what technology might be available or useful to help address a particular kind of challenge? So to give some examples of adaptation. Now I tend to communicate through the lens of blindness, because blindness is kind of a quintessential example. It exemplifies the human condition under what is commonly conceived and perceived as a considerable stress, considerable challenge. Okay, so blindness.
But all of us have our own challenges.
Yeah,
right?
yes. So
Yeah.
so in that sense, blindness is just a human condition. It tends to be a relatively challenging one, but it simply is a human condition. So if you look at blindness as an exemplar of the human condition, then we can kind of go from there in terms of adaptations. So with blindness, adaptations would be things that, well, with anyone, adaptations would be things that help us to function better. In the case of blindness, they might be things like, some people have seen these bumpy pavements. They're blister pavements at the corners of roads, on the edges of railroad platforms, at the tops of stairs. Basically, those things are environmental adaptations that help a blind person to know that there is a surface change coming, or that you're about to walk into a road or a trafficked area. In other countries, they'll have lines that go across open space in commonly traveled areas like transit stations and airports. So they're designed to help a blind person move across open space and know where they're going. Now we come to capacity. We're talking about personal competence, capability. What are your skills? What are your abilities as a person? And they may be physical abilities, strength, endurance, health, speed. They may be mental abilities. There are multiple, at least 7 different kinds of intelligence that people bring with them. They may be skills. Echolocation, for example, is a capacity. So it just has to, I use the term capacity because it tends to be a jargon term in special education. I work in special education, and we talk a lot about capacity. So that's why I use the term, but we're really talking about personal competence, learning skills, developing, refining, honing personal abilities. And the next is technology. So technology, we're talking basically high tech and low tech technology. So low tech technology would be something as simple as a white cane. This is a folding cane. I will unfold it, but you won't be able to see the whole thing. One of my claims to fame or claims to infamy is that I regard the cane, the simple white stick that a blind person uses, very differently than is conventionally regarded. So this cane uses, this is actually a ceramic tip. I don't typically use this particular tip, but I used it in the snow the other day because it was conducive to that. But the tip I normally use is about this size and a little bit lighter because it's made of a high impact plastic. The tip that is often distributed for blind people is this rollerball tip. And this tip, I'll hand it to you.
Okay.
It weighs about as much as a baseball,
It's heavy.
maybe more. It's very heavy.
Very heavy.
It's very heavy. Yeah, it is very heavy. Whereas if you hold this by comparison,
Oh, it's nothing.
it's nothing, right?
Right.
And
Oh,
I
okay.
actually do an experiment where I do a
Wow.
I put the canes on a scale, a balancing scale, and I don't even weigh them separately. I just put them on a scale, and the one with the tip will just completely off balance the scale,
Yeah.
right? So anyway, if you're using a cane day in and day out, the weight really matters and the balance really matters. So that's just an example. It's an example of refining low tech, something as simple as a cane. Bamboo is actually not bad. I mean, you could, I've used it. It's not too bad. And it comes right out of nature. So that's low tech. A high tech example would be something like I mean, I can go on and on about high tech, but something like an iPhone. My iPhone is full of different kinds of techie things that I use to help navigate. One is Open Compass.
240 compass, 242
Okay, make
degrees.
sure this is
SW,
calibrated.
245 degrees. SW.
Thing. Anytime you move, you have to orient. So you're sort of like a living orienteer all the time. Okay. So if you know where north is, of course, the iPhone compass will tell you where north, south. It'll give you the degree relative to north of wherever you're facing.
Daniel travels the world all by himself, and I don't know. I think most of us think that blind folks have to be on somebody's arm, don't we?
Well, I mean, look, a blind person is going to use support as a you know, the S in acts is support. So support certainly factors into the self-determination for all of us. I mean, there aren't many people who never use support of some form or other.
Yeah.
Okay.
Even if you have your sight.
Even if you have
Yeah,
your
we need
everything,
support, right?
You need some, you know, people need support for things.
Yeah.
A blind person is going to need support for what I call visual interpretation. So a blind person may access interpreters of the visual environment in much the same way that a deaf person accesses, right, interpreters of the social environment. Helen Keller said, deafness separates you from people, blindness separates you from things. Well, Helen Keller would know both. She was deaf-blind. So what we're talking about with the ACTS framework is how a blind person reconnects with things. And support is one of those ways of doing it. However, you don't always have support. You can't always rely on support. I can't pay for someone to go with me everywhere all the time. People, I guess, sort of assume that you would, but I don't. So you sight surf, you know, you sort of kind of go from sighted person to sighted person to sighted person until, you know, there isn't a wave, there isn't a person, there isn't someone to move you to the next thing. So now it becomes, what do? It's technology, it's capacity, it's adaptations to make sure you aren't left stranded. The thing about support, though, is the term I often use is socialization or social engagement. For social engagement to work, it has to be reciprocal. It isn't just about who supports you. It's about how you support others. So it has to go both ways. Otherwise, you're left with a rather empty custodial, one-way custodial relationship. The biggest issue that I have where blindness is concerned is not about whether or not a blind person uses support or even how much support a blind person uses. It's more about how the whole support concept tends to be introduced to blind people, especially blind children. You are essentially told how you're going to be supported, who's going to support you, when they support you, and where they're going to support you, and under what circumstances. Almost all agency is removed where blind children are concerned as regards support. So the big issue that I have is personal agency in the support process. Support is and must be an agreement between people, between those involved. So how support is rendered, or who, or to where, or when, or under what circumstances is all part of an individual's agency, whether you're blind or not. That's the key. There is quite possibly, quite probably, quite certainly no human on this planet who doesn't face challenges or who hasn't at some point in their lives faced challenges. So Helen Keller provides us with an insight into this. So Helen Keller could not see, could not hear, arguably one of the most dependent people, and yet also one of the most self-determined people, and one of history's most highest achieving people. And she tells us that, as she puts it, I cannot do everything, but I can do something. I must not fail to do the something I can do. And that made her world famous. And we quote Helen Keller all the time about various things. It's one of the reasons I don't tend to use the word independent. I tend to use the word self-determination because independent is just first of all, independence is just such a narrow slice of what self-determination really is. And it doesn't really give you a very nuanced breadth and depth picture of what self-determination is. Independence is a culturally loaded concept and a regionally loaded concept. And it's very ill-defined. No one has bothered to really operationalize what independence is. Okay, so as a blind person, from a conventional standpoint, one might argue that I am more dependent on, as Helen Keller would put it, reconnecting to things, more dependent than other people. From an emotional standpoint and a psychological standpoint, I've lived on my own since I was 18. I am now, well, as of next month.
Our birthdays are
yeah,
one
our
day
birthdays
apart.
are one day apart. I'll be 57. And I have never really felt the need for validation or confirmation or affirmation from others. So, by that index, one could say that I'm emotionally more independent than most, but physically more dependent than many. And yet I've been to 41 countries. So, what does independence or dependence even mean? So self-determination is really the key. It's really where it's at.
And you could apply this to the way we're reimagining education, don't you think?
Well, education, for sure, education. Yes. Education across the lifespan.
Yeah, I had a thought leader in one of these interviews remind me that education was developed 200-300 years ago to create better factory workers.
Yeah.
And that's a whole different skill set than we need today.
Yeah.
And her big deal is that, we were learning for hundreds of years facts, but now we're all walking around with a computer in our hands. So facts are not what children need to learn. Yeah. They need to learn how to come up with solutions, to collaborate, to work ingeniously with others, to solve their problems, to cope with the things that come to us in life.
And that is certainly not what education has historically been conducive.
But what you're saying about not looking at independence as the goal, looking at self-determination as the goal, that's a beautiful thing.
I think so.
That leads to self-expression.
Yeah, I think it leads to a lot of self things. It leads to self-expression. It leads to a kind of self-efficacy, confidence, and it leads to achievement. So achievement, without looking at how you achieve, but more what you achieve. If you're able to get where you need to go and do what you need to do, but you can't drive, then you find other ways to get where you need to go and do what you need to do. Mm-hmm. And the achievement is what you're able to accomplish as you go where you need to go and do what you need to do. Whether it is by driving or flying, not many people have their own pilot's license. So most people are reliant on someone else to fly them places, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. There's another aspect to self-determination, which has to do with the domains of resources which we access and domains in which we function. So it's about access and function, or access and operation, where we operate, how we operate. So let me give you some examples. So there are basically 5 domains. There's the mental domain. So what goes on inside our head, what we're able to access from within our head, what we're able to do in our head, our emotions, our psychology, our intellect, the 7+++ areas of intelligence. That all happens, inside our head. Spirituality, energy, personality, all that intrapersonal stuff. The second is what I call the body domain. So it has to do with what we're able to do with our hands, what we're able to do with our bodies, our hands, our feet, anything that's directly connected to our bodies, but also anything that occurs within our bodies. So our health, our strength, our vitality, all that's the body domain. For a blind person, it may have to do specifically with what you can easily reach, essentially. So your body space is essentially comprised by what you can physically touch, basically. Then the third would be the social domain. So interaction, communication, social engagement, socialization, interpersonal stuff. The fourth would be the symbolic domain. So everything that is written, everything that is graphic, everything that is images, photos, everything that is represented by writing or images meant to communicate something to someone. Even, lines on the floor, arrows that point this way, all the environmental markups that we use fall into the symbolic domain. The fifth is what I am currently calling the physical object domain, which has to do with all the physical world that lies beyond our body space. It's the world. It's the things that Helen Keller was talking about, the things that lie outside our body domain. The world is full of things, places, people, anything, items. Okay. So when we look at it that way, we can conceptualize those domains that people may have the easiest time accessing or more difficult time accessing, depending on your background, depending on your personality, depending on your particular, what I call an ability structure.
Okay, so this is a good time for us to hear a little bit about how you grew up, because that made a fundamental difference. Your mom and her reaction to what you were going through. Tell us a little bit about your story.
Well, there's, depending on how you look at it, there's a lot or a little to tell. My mom, so I lost my vision, well, both eyes actually. The eyes that you see here are artificial. They were designed by an artist, a good artist.
They're really beautiful. It's hard. It's hard to be around him and not think that he can see. It really is, because he walks around things, and then his eyes look like that.
The eyes, I'm lucky because they never really show fatigue,
no,
or age, or anything. Anyway, so I lost them due to cancer, and when the second eye was taken, and it became known that I was totally blind, my mom's reaction was basically, good, we can take him home. This is over. This medical stuff, this worry, all these difficult decisions, all these tests, all of the treatments are over. And she didn't regard blindness as affecting my well-being in a definitively significant way. She knew it would be a challenge. What affected my well-being was cancer. Right? Okay, that affects your well-being. Okay, so you got to figure out how to restore your well-being. Once the cancer was gone, she saw my well-being as restored. Now the blindness imposes a challenge, or faces me with a challenge that we now have to prepare him for, him being me. So in a way, my mom sort of was an example of this self-determination thing. She just looked at it very pragmatically. Yeah,
you're right. I just thinking about it just now.
She wouldn't have put it in these terms, but she would have cranked this through her brain in much the same way that I've just articulated here.
Adaptability, capacity,
technology and support.
Like, what are you going to need to make this work?
What are you going to need to make this work? And for her, it was, all thrusters firing. Everything was possible. So, if it was supports, if it was friends, she trusted me to have sound judgment, to pick good, trustworthy friends, to facilitate things. If it was capacity, she trusted me to be able to build the capacities that were needed. Technologies were fairly scarce at the time, but there was the cane and there was the compass. And then adaptations. Braille is an adaptation, being able to read with your fingers instead of your eyes. And I was very good at Braille, and I started learning Braille in nursery school when other kids were beginning to learn their letters.
But she didn't have echolocation in the bag as an adaptation, did she? Did she know?
No. She knew. No. So
nothing.
No. Yeah. So I think in my case, I don't know why I began clicking. I do know that many blind children, if they are not restricted, so if the attitude is about the self-determination piece, developing capacities, trusting your child to be able to find and claim their freedom and giving value to that, then capacities develop. The whole ACTS framework develops. You find your supports, you find your technology. I wanted a compass because I had been exposed by the age of 8 to cardinal directions. What are those? Well, someone talked about north, south, east, and west. And yes, people use a compass for that. Does a Braille compass exist? Well, by golly, it does, right? And then adaptations. What adaptations are available? If I wanted to play a sport, were there ways to adapt that sport? If I wanted to play a game, board games are a good example, because things like chess and backgammon and Connect Four, I mean, all these things where you would typically have a board and you'd have pieces and they'd be different colors and things. If you just tactilize all of that, and the whites feel this way and the blacks feel that way, and there are little squares on the board that you can feel so you can move your piece, and all of those kinds of things. The cards that you draw are Braille. Monopoly is a good example, because they've brailled all of that. The money is brailled, the cards are all brailled, the squares that you move around the board are all brailled. Everything's brailled. So that's an adaptation.
Okay, so you started clicking at the world and your mom didn't shush you.
So echolocation, because I think it's because not only were my parents open to my participating in the world in a manner that was secure, efficacious, and equitable. Okay, right. And the 5 domains as well, right? We need to develop his mental capacities. We need to develop his social skills, which were, by the way, quite the challenge up until my teenage years. We need to develop his capacity to access the symbolic environment, i.e. Braille. We need to develop the capacity for him to do things. I mean, I did wood shop when I was in 7th grade. I actually soldered in electronics shop.
You did. You welded. You
made
a fantastic spider.
Yeah, I did. I
in
welded.
my welding shop the last time.
So it was it was accessing the body domain.
Yes.
And then what do we do to help him access the physical object domain? Of course, echolocation was a part of that, but being allowed to build my support network was also a big part of that. Right. Many blind people are isolated from that, especially these days. They're isolated. They are systematically and institutionally excluded from the big bad sighted kids.
Well, I always have thought it was strange how your mom got it through her head that it was okay for you to ride a bike. I mean, you were riding a bike at a very young age.
So that was more my dad's idea.
Okay. But by then you were very proficient at clicking at the world.
Yes.
Knowing where the parked cars
so
were.
I had to yes. It was easy for me to determine. Well, the advantage too was being small. Okay, so I was 6 or 7 years old when I began riding a bike.
Your dad brought him a bike?
But I was very young when I began using echolocation. And when you're that young, the world is big. Everything's big. So a parked car is gargantuan to a 3-year-old.
Yes.
And even on a bicycle, everything's big. So I noted other kids riding their bikes in the neighborhood, especially older kids. But it's like, okay, that's something to aspire to. People are moving on bicycles, and I wanted to learn to do that. So I was at a friend of the family's house, and they had the bike was way too small for me. I think it was like a toddler bicycle, but it was 2-wheeled, and I was easily able to touch the ground, but I taught myself how to move quickly enough to balance. And I remember there was this retaining wall. It must have been a planter or something. It was a big, long retaining wall, which to an adult, might have been, I don't know, knee height or thigh height perhaps. But to a 5-year-old, it was big enough that I could use that as a point of reference. So I taught myself how to ride along the wall.
Because you could hear that it was there.
I at first I did it by touch.
Okay.
And I probably used the wall to help balance. And then I moved further and further away. I had to in order to get the speed.
Yeah.
And so, yes, I would have been clicking like mad at this wall to, to know where it was and to know where I was going. And then one day my dad showed up with a secondhand bicycle, and he would have come off of a bender to do that. So,
We all have complicated families.
very complicated family histories. So my dad spent plenty of time in bars and so forth. And I'm sure my parents argued rather vehemently over this bicycle thing. But once it was given, they weren't going to take it away. So the next thing was to learn to ride it. And I did, clicking like mad. I'm using the house lines, the lines of houses and curbs to maintain my sense of direction. So that's how I go a more or less straight line, hopefully, down the road. And it was just up and down the road at first in a quiet neighborhood. It wasn't a cul-de-sac exactly, but it was a pretty low traffic area. And other kids were riding as well. So there was always someone kind of, I guess, watching.
Mhm.
But a little echolocation goes a long way toward bridging the gap left by when the lights go out, left by non-sightedness.
Mhm. Let's take a break, and we come back. We'll talk about some of these you got to tell the donut quest story.
Yes.
And lots of other things about how you started to work with blind folks and how this whole thing unfolded. And I know folks will see themselves in this way that we can share our struggles and see a new paths just by seeing the path that somebody else came across.
Sure.
Okay, so let's take a break.
You know how the constant negative noise in our digital lives feels like it's reaching a boiling point? Now, many of us have tuned out the news and social media almost entirely. Well, it doesn't have to be that way. There are newsworthy stories about amazing progress, innovation, leaps in human potential, and wonders in the natural world, and they're just not reaching the top of our feeds. We can have access to this, but none of us has the time or maybe even the emotional stamina to search through all the doom and gloom news to find what's right with the world. Okay, enter the Goodness Exchange. There, we are giving instant access to positive news for curious people. Did you hear about the recent Harvard study that found that exposure to just 4 minutes of good news can make you 32% less anxious and 18% more optimistic? Well, I don't know about you, but I need those kind of numbers in my life. So, if you want to live with more joy and way less fear, it's really simple. First, you join us at the Goodness Exchange. Our subscription model is a pay what you can model so that everyone around the world has the opportunity to access this kind of content. And we've promised no politics and no ads for about a decade, so you're safe from all that distraction as well. Second, you allow this new, more positive, balanced worldview to put a spring in your step again. It can change the way you react to your kids, your coworkers, everybody you come in contact with. And the stories we write about can make you the idea person in your circles. These challenging times call for us to wake up and take control of our perspective. The people who use the Goodness Exchange have the ability to react to the harshness of the world much different because they know way more about what's right with the world. And that's a resource. So subscribe to the Goodness Exchange, our YouTube channel and the podcast, and use this content to live a more expansive worldview. It is still an amazing world out there, and you can be a part of it. Welcome to the Conspiracy of Goodness.
Okay, we're back. So I'm here with Daniel Kish, one of the world's most inspirational speakers. Daniel speaks about his extraordinary ability to see the world with sound. I want to tell people that we'll put this in the show notes, but you have an amazing 2015 TED Talk.
Yes.
That has millions of views.
Yes.
And there you'll really get an idea of what Daniel's up to from an actual practice of what he does. Speaking of this practice, you tell this amazingly funny, nice story about you and a student having a hankering for donuts one night.
So this student was a teenager. I mean, I think he just turned 18. He was staying with me in Orange County. We both had our bikes, and we were looking to strengthen, to develop, to refine our bicycling skills, if you will. So echolocating from a bicycle. And we were riding separate bikes. And we decided to go out late at night because there's less traffic late at night. You're less bothered by people. You have to deal with fewer people, basically fewer impediments, if you will. And as we were kind of riding around, basically just navigating the area around where I live, clicking, both of us, like crazy, we happened to smell donuts. And it would have been between midnight and 1 o'clock in the morning, perhaps. And we kind of followed our noses and we kind of tracked down the smell to a particular parking lot that had a donut store that sadly was closed. So we didn't get our donuts. And as we were in the process of leaving and riding off, we were accosted by a pair of police officers who evidently saw us ride into this dark parking lot. To be fair, neither of us really appreciated just how dark it was.
Because you wouldn't.
We didn't. Yeah. And it looked suspicious, I guess, for a couple of guys on bicycles wandering into, pausing, and then wandering out of this parking lot. And when he pulled us over, he was able to determine that we couldn't see very well. Maybe he saw our canes on the back, but we had racks on our bikes. I'm not sure how he knew, but he asked us, "Look, guys, how much can you see?" And my answer was, "Well, we see well enough." And then he asked, he could have done any number of things. If he had done the, follow the light trick, that might have really blown our cover in a terrible way. But he didn't do that. He said, "Well, do you know where you are? Do you know what street you're on?" And I did know what street we were on. So I told him. And he says, "All right, you guys just go back home," which was fair enough. It was reasonable. And we did. But yeah, he let us go because we'd convinced him that we could see, quote, well enough, unquote. I mean, the ACTS framework applies in the sense that we chose when to ride. So we made a calculus. And that, in a sense, was our adaptation. We didn't do this in the middle of the day when things might have been more trickier, more difficult. The capacity, well, we had the capacity to echolocate, but that was actually the capacity we were working on refining and developing to use it to navigate more effectively. We didn't really have technology at that time per se, although if this questionable exercise were to be repeated these days, we'd have GPS, we'd have ways to determine just how dark things were. I mean, there are lots and lots and lots and lots of apps that we could access on our iPhones that would give us all kinds of information that we didn't have available to us 20, 30 years ago. And then, of course, support. Well, the supports we had were each other. However, I had support in learning the area to begin with. So when it came to learning my way around my home area, I had lots of support to do that, to facilitate that mapping. And then once that was facilitated, then that was what I knew and what I could draw upon.
One of the things that you make a pretty good point of, well, first of all, we should tell people that you started teaching students this method in 1993, right?
Yeah. It was part of my thesis project.
Okay.
So my master's thesis. So I had 24 blind children with whom I was working at that time. And they were all part of this thesis project.
And so you made this really, really important distinction the other day when we were talking. You said blind people who don't have access to Daniel's work, that we're still giving blind people cautions instruction. And there's a big difference between cautions instructions and teaching people how to live in the world as it's set up.
Yes. So a lot of the instruction that blind people receive is about how to be cautionary. It's about the risks and hazards, doubts and uncertainties of blindness, and how to tiptoe around those, I guess. So it casts blindness into a much darker perspective and puts people on edge. And it's just not, it's not conducive to this neutralization of fear that I talk about. So for us, it's about how to. So first of all, you had to figure out how you came in the first place. How did you get there?
Right.
What logistics and strategies did you use to get there as a blind person in the first place? You're not seeing anything, but you need to somehow figure out what is around you and where it is and how to get to it and what to do with it. So that's all logistics and strategy. The ACTS framework provides a rubric for developing these logistics and strategies. And then the conquer, well, you know, I mean, not everyone has to conquer just because they saw something. But if conquer is what you want to do, then there's a whole other set of logistics and strategies.
Right.
How does a blind person conquer? Well, okay, but everyone has to strategize
And struggle.
and yes, and negotiate a challenge. Because the getting there, everyone had to figure out how to get there. I mean, how do you get across the Atlantic Ocean, you know, on ships?
Mm-hmm.
You can't see to the other side. You have to strategize that.
Mm-hmm.
So that's kind of like being blind in a way. Getting across the Atlantic Ocean or getting across the living room, it's kind of the same thing in a way.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, okay, I saw. Well, a sighted person kind of sees what they see. But what if you can't see what you see? Well, then you use technology, you use monoculars, you use binoculars, you use things to allow you to see more, to allow you to see better. Or you access information that other people have,
Right.
who've maybe gone there before you or have explored an area before you, or have made maps of an area perhaps. And then you conquer. Well,
And that's essentially what you're doing.
yeah. Then you have to figure out how you're going to conquer, who you're going to conquer, and what you're going to use to conquer, and all the rest.
Well, you know, yesterday we were having a chat around the fire. We talked about how much it's important to struggle. The struggle part is important. Like you're one of the things that was different maybe about your upbringing than a lot of the ways that you see blind kids being brought up is that your parents were willing to let you struggle. Is that a good characterization?
They didn't insulate me from the requirement of strategizing
Oh,
and
that's huge.
logisticizing.
That's huge.
I mean, yeah, I mean, okay, all right. So I don't like to think of it really as struggling. It certainly can feel that way, I guess.
Yeah.
And it can certainly, to a sighted person watching a blind person do almost anything, yes, I guess it looks like a struggle. If I left all my toys all over the front lawn, I did something wrong. I left my toys all over the front lawn. So go pick up your toys. Well, that might take me an hour to pick up my toys from, you know, a front lawn that's only, I don't know, 30 by 30 feet or something.
Yeah. But
But-
did you have to do it?
Well, yeah, of course. So
Of course.
so that's you can call that a struggle.
Yeah.
But, you know, to a blind person, I mean, I guess a day-to-day activity doesn't necessarily get encoded as a struggle. I'll give you an example. So I was in a hotel and I needed to go down. So I was in the elevator area. There were 5 or 6 elevators or whatever. And I reached out to look for the button, and I reached out, and you know, where I touched on the wall, there was no button. So now it's a process of finding the button. Blindness is very interesting. When I talk about blindness, you know, people think if you're blind, you can't do things. Blind people can do really just about anything. The main difficulty with blindness is finding things. So blinding challenges finding is what I sometimes say. So this, you know, once I find the button, I can certainly press the button, but I have to find the button. And I didn't have anyone with me at the time to help look for the button. So my way of finding the button is to find the button. It's to basically, sir, it could take me, 15 seconds. It could take me 5 minutes to find this button, which is somewhere. I know it's somewhere, but where? So as I reach out, I barely touched the wall. I was there for 3 seconds, not long. An elevator, a hotel staff member comes up and says, I guess he says, sir, are you trying to find the button? And the answer to that question is yes. But the way he asked the question was implied a struggle. To me, the finding process is the process. I'm not trying to find the button. I'm just finding the button.
Right.
So, when we talk about the struggle, from a sighted perspective, it most certainly looks like a struggle. And I don't remember how long it took me to find the button. He probably pointed it out at that point.
Yeah.
But, that's the difference.
That is the difference. And it comes back to something that you reminded me of the other day. This whole world of touchscreens is messing with your abilities.
Well, touchscreens aren't accessible unless they are. I mean,
Yeah.
of course, my iPhone is accessible.
Yeah.
And it was made accessible. But most touchscreens, my trip over here from Vienna was on an airplane, and also from the US to London, was in an airplane where all controls were accessed by a touchscreen, and including the call button. So I had no way to get hold of anyone. I couldn't reach out to flight attendants or anything, because it's all done by touchscreen. So modern planes are more and more moving to touchscreen access, and no one has given the slightest thought to people who can't use touchscreens.
And you've noted that there are like trends where we leave people out of our thinking, right? And that messes with the system. You told me how it used to be that you could be you're talking in a train station in England. They just decided that there was going to be no more public announcements.
Yeah, it was in England. It was. And that phase seems to have been passed. I don't see this happening there now, but there was a period of time when they were trying to dispense with oral announcements. And I don't know why exactly. The reason given was it disturbs customers or it disturbs passengers. Well, it must have been more disturbing to customers and passengers to not have verbal announcements, because they're back. But there was a period of time when they were really actively working to phase them out. Stop announcements on trains, on buses, airplane information at airports, please board through gate so-and-so, those going to such and such a place, please board here. All of those were gone. And certainly blind people were missing their stops and missing their flights, but they were not the only ones.
Now, one thing we haven't talked about at all is that you teach people of all ages. You have a load of fun from all the videos that you'll see when you go and do a search of Daniel Kish. You'll see him having the most amazing time with children. But you work with folks who've lost their sight suddenly as adults, so they were once sighted, or even people with, I suppose, macular degeneration and so forth. What's the oldest person you've ever taught?
The oldest person I've ever taught was 83. And he was from Australia.
Yeah.
And he had gone, as he put it, black blind about 3 months before. And he was a real spitfire. He was motivated. He was energized. He was perceptive. He still seemed to have very good hearing. So it's really, young people have some advantages when it comes to learning things, I guess. But neuroplasticity, let's be clear, is very much operative across the lifespan. It doesn't matter how old you are. So a big part of it really is, aside from the youth factor, it's really about motivation. It's about opportunity to practice, to apply, to implement what you're learning. And then under increasingly challenging conditions, it's through the increased challenge that we refine what it is that we're learning.
Is it about also suspending some beliefs that have been sort of drilled into you? I mean, isn't that, I saw this great video of you. I will share, we're going to share lots and lots of links in the actual article on the Goodness Exchange, where you can see some of this videography of Daniel doing what he's doing. It's hard to describe, so I'm barely trying to describe it here today. But I saw this hilarious video of you literally running down a sidewalk after that kid on the skateboard, a blind kid on the skateboard.
Yeah.
And you're hustling, man.
Yeah, we are both, well, he's on the skateboard. So yeah, I'm definitely hustling to keep up. Yeah.
It looks like he's fearless, like he's not having to suspend any beliefs.
No, I mean, so I think it's partly suspending belief. It's also partly neutralizing apprehension. I have students who are much more cautious.
Okay.
And students who just either don't really believe they can do something, or they're just not really motivated to do it. I can't skateboard. I can't skateboard anywhere near as well as he does. I can run after him, but I can't skateboard the way he does. I taught him the perceptual capacity and to some degree the physical capacity to skateboard, although to be honest, most of that's him. The physical capacity, he just has naturally good balance and he's naturally pretty fearless. And he applied that to learning how to skateboard. And for the sake of the camera, I was chasing after him to keep up with him.
Is that a kind of a lesson for us all too? If we can suspend, how do you word it? You word it in such a nice way.
It's neutralizing fear of the unknown.
Mm-hmm.
It's also neutralizing fear of the what if.
Right.
I call it don't if yourself.
Yeah.
So we tend to what if or if only. Those are the two big ones. And I hear that a lot. What if we get lost? What if we run into something? What if we look foolish? Those are probably the two biggest things. I don't tend to speak for blind people, but if I were, from the thousands of students I've worked with, getting hurt and running into things, that's not something that tends to be top of mind for blind people.
Okay.
Really.
And
I think most people think, if you're blind, you're going to run into something. Don't run into something. You're going to get yourself hurt. That's not really the biggest thing that blind people tend to be worried about. It's getting lost or feeling lost, which can be two different things, and looking foolish or feeling foolish. Those are the two biggest things. There are issues around traffic. A lot of blind people do fear traffic and are apprehensive about how to deal with vehicular traffic. And I see that increasingly these days with diminished training around traffic and increased complexity of traffic situations. Urban planners don't tend to factor in pedestrians when they're planning for traffic movement. The pedestrian just isn't part of that equation. And certainly blind pedestrians aren't.
Yeah, right.
So the environment is becoming more and more complex and more visually loaded, and blind people are receiving less and less training to deal with it. So there is a mounting fear or apprehension around dealing with traffic.
Talk to us a little bit about your thoughts on awe these days. Awe is something that I felt when I first saw your work, but I see it all around me more than I ever did. And I imagine you have some thoughts on that.
Well, awe is one of our most powerful emotions. I think it's being recognized as a kind of new basic emotion, but it has tremendous therapeutic value. Sense of awe really, really opens us up to almost being childlike again. Children are masters of learning, masters of adaptation, masters of openness. There is so much that we as adults have lost touch with that children can teach us. And awe is a way in to transcending any kind of stuck place which we might encounter in our lives, or transcending fear, or transcending some blockage or some impediment that we face. To me, awe, AWE, is a nice acronym for awareness, willingness, and exploration. So the willingness part is you have to be willing to do it. You have to be willing, especially as adults. Children do this naturally. We as grown-ups condition children out of this process, sadly. As adults, we need to be willing to exercise the will to be open to newness, to novelty, to an extension or an expansion of where we are. And that leads us to awareness. So you have to be aware to increase our awareness, to penetrate the veils that we put around ourselves. What is new? What is different? What exists around us that we did not notice before that may be relevant? It probably is relevant, but even if it isn't relevant, that doesn't mean it isn't interesting. That doesn't mean it isn't intriguing or exciting. And exploration is about the willingness to apply our awareness to reaching beyond ourselves, to reaching outside of ourselves, to reaching beyond what we think we know into what we can know. So for me, a daily practice of that, of looking at our surroundings as if we're looking at them for the first time. And every time you do that, you will find something different. You will find something new.
And you will probably find something to be grateful for.
Yeah, I mean, if you,
This
yeah,
is the thing.
the gratitude element is another healing aspect. It's another healing element.
So as we wrap up, we've talked about so many things today, and so I can't thank you enough for joining us. And as we wrap up, I've got two questions I like to ask almost everyone that I chat with. You have this huge amount of experience in the world. Some, like the rest of us, have experienced it, most of it very different. What do you really wish people knew?
I wish people knew that they don't know as much as they think. I think it behooves us to question what we think we know. We rest in this illusion of certainty to the extent that when other people approach us with what they know, we tend to filter what they extend to us about what they know through what we know or what we think we know. So we tend to evaluate other people's knowledge against our own. And I believe that's a huge mistake. It is a way to really, really hamper, to really, really bog down human advancement and our own personal advancement. How can you advance if you already think you know? Right? So the greatest learning happens when we challenge what we think we know and when we are open to other channels of knowing. That is what I wish people knew.
That is expansive. That is really expansive. So I'm going to have to think about that a lot. Okay, so I'd like to wrap up on one last question. Daniel, you're out there in the world, you're traveling the world all the time, trying to reach people who have connected with you and want to learn this, want their children to learn it, want access to this kind of knowledge. I know that you've been studied by scientists. Daniel's been written about in Smithsonian Magazine, and yet I feel disappointed that more people don't know about your work and don't know can't see what's possible. If we know that Daniel's brain can work like this and so can ours, then what else is possible? Where can people find you? How can people get a hold of you and connect with you?
worldaccessfortheblind.org or visioneers.org is the repository basically for a lot of what we do and what we've accomplished over the years.
And you can connect with Daniel there exactly like I did one night about 8 years ago.
Right after the TED Talk.
Yes, actually. Right after the TED Talk. I saw his TED Talk, and there on the World Access for the Blind website was a telephone number, and I just up and called it one night.
Yeah.
So I got to tell you, Daniel is very accessible. And that leads us to my final question. What has to happen next to blow this whole thing open and your insights spread through the world so we can all have access to it and we can be expanded?
It's really the resources and interest in building a way to reach more people in more places, either through an outreach method or through an academy. So a physical academy as well as a virtual academy. So we have a blueprint for a virtual academy and physical academy and an outreach component. Right now, it's mostly outreach. So there's a tremendous amount of diffusion, if you will, trying to train more instructors and trying to reach more people. It's resource intensive and it's time intensive. And the two biggest sort of myths, I guess, there are many myths. One is everything that could be done for blind people is being done for blind people, right? I mean, the questions that people ask.
And that's a myth.
It's a myth.
Yes.
It's a myth. Very, very little is really being done for blind people that blind people find useful. But like, I mean, Chuck asked me the other day, like,
My husband.
Yeah, your husband, when you're traveling in a public place or in a, an airport or something, aren't there like sound beacons or things that you can use to help you get from place to place? And the answer is, of course, absolutely not. Not only is there not, but no one's really thought of it. And the few who have not been able to implement it because it's an infrastructural implementation. So there are many, many, many things that blind people could benefit from that just aren't being done. I won't enumerate them here, but believe me, there are plentiful. A great deal of funding that could be made available for blind people to exercise more self-determination, to be more included in their communities, and to be able to navigate their communities more effectively. That just isn't happening. The other thing is that there's still a great deal of institutionalized exclusion and isolation happening to blind people and against blind people. And this is, well, it's just an observation. And so blindness is often regarded economically and politically as a lost cause. And I can prove that it isn't. So if resources are mobilized a certain way toward a certain end, blind people are responsive and proactive and productive. And they bring as much to the table as anyone else. They are as productive and contributory as anyone else. But like anyone else, they need the resources and leverage to realize that, to become that.
Mm-hmm. So I'd say, from my observation and knowing you well, if you know someone who's blind, or people that are in a position to look at this through the lens of all this possibility that we've been talking about for an hour, Daniel will make the most of any contacts that he gets.
Well, I'll make the most of any contacts that we get. The biggest struggle we have as an organization is finding funding.
Yes.
To work with people. So I have a waiting list of dozens and dozens and dozens of people who have not received services because there are no resources to mobilize those services.
Okay. Well, we can all affect that in our own little ways, by word of mouth, by getting in contact with visionaries, by sharing his story with folks that might be able to connect the dots.
Yes,
for this.
Yes. Connecting the dots would be very helpful.
Yes. Okay, well, Daniel, thank you so much for coming to the Conspiracy of Goodness podcast and bringing all this wonder and inspiration.
It was a pleasure.
Yes. Okay, well, thank you all yourselves for joining us. And I hope the wonder and awe and ideas that Daniel and I shared can help you through the rest of your week, and you'll start finding all the joy that we've been talking about. Thanks.